She thought a fancy dress and a fat wallet gave her the right to humiliate anyone beneath her, until the owner of the restaurant stood up and turned the whole room silent. What started as a routine dinner quickly became a public reckoning in one of Charleston's most upscale spots. This is the story of how true class isn't worn, it's shown. At Harper's, the clink of crystal and the soft hum of refined conversation floated through the air like music. The restaurant, nestled in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, was the kind of place where linen napkins were folded like origami and reservations were whispered like secrets among the city's elite. Light spilled from glimmering chandeliers, dancing off polished mahogany tables and brass-rimmed sconces. Servers moved like clockwork, weaving between tables with trays of seared scallops and dry-aged steaks, their steps silent against the marble floor. And at the center of this elegant choreography, one table buzzed louder than the rest. Veronica Langston, 52 and proud of every silver strand in her immaculately coiffed hair, sat with the casual confidence of someone who had never once waited to be noticed. Her voice, sharp and lilting, sliced through the murmur of nearby diners like a cello playing out of tune. Draped in a cream silk blouse and a diamond necklace that caught every glint of candlelight, Veronica gestured broadly as she recounted her recent trip to the French Riviera. The villa was divine, she declared, swirling her wine. Private chef, heated infinity pool. And the views. My God, you could see all the way to Nice. Not like this place, but it'll do for Charleston. Across from her sat Denise and Claudia, equally well-heeled but quieter in their display, each nodding and laughing in turn as Veronica held court. Their makeup was flawless, their dresses tailored, but they deferred to Veronica in that subtle way people do when they know they're seated next to a queen bee. Veronica thrived in settings like this, surrounded by luxury, attention, and a captive audience, and tonight she was performing. A few tables away, Trinity James stood with a tray in her hands, balancing 3 water glasses with steady fingers and tired eyes. 20 years old, with dark curls pinned back in a neat bun and a quiet poise that came from years of pushing through long days, Trinity didn't look like someone who belonged in Veronica's world. But she did belong here, in this restaurant, on this floor, earning every dollar she could toward her nursing degree. She worked 6 days a week, sometimes double shifts, and though exhaustion tugged at her bones, she never let it show. Not when she needed every cent, not when her mother's rent was due, not when she still had textbooks to pay off. She approached the table with a practiced smile and a soft, "Good evening, ladies. May I offer you something to start?" Her voice was smooth, professional, her notepad ready. Veronica didn't glance up at first. She waved her hand, still in the middle of a story about her designer shoes getting mud-stained at a polo match. It wasn't until Trinity stood quietly, waiting with the kind of grace only the overlooked can master, that Veronica looked up. "Oh, finally," she said with an exasperated breath. Her eyes scanned Trinity like she was an off-brand handbag in a luxury boutique. "We've been sitting here for almost 5 minutes, haven't we?" she asked her friends, though neither confirmed nor denied. "You'd think a place like this would hire staff who can move a little faster, or at least smile like they mean it." Trinity's spine stiffened slightly, but her expression didn't flicker. She took their drink orders, nodded politely, and returned moments later with glasses balanced in both hands. When she returned again to present the entrees, Veronica had ordered the filet mignon rare. She placed the plate carefully in front of her and offered a gentle, "I hope you enjoy your meal." Veronica lifted her knife, sliced through the center, and barely paused before letting out a dramatic sigh. "Oh, come on. This is closer to medium. Look at it. It's pink, not red." She tilted the plate toward Trinity. "What do they teach you back there? Or do you just guess and hope we don't notice?" Trinity's voice remained even. "I'm very sorry, Mom. I'll have the kitchen remake it right away." "Don't bother," Veronica cut in. "By the time it comes back, we'll be halfway through the evening. I suppose I'll just suffer through this one like I suffer through Charleston's tragic excuse for fine dining." Her friends chuckled under their breath, sensing the performance. "Honestly, you people act like you're doing us a favor, All I want is a decent steak and a server who knows the difference between rare and ruined." Across the room, Isaiah Carter set his glass of water down with deliberate quiet. Seated alone in a corner booth, dressed in a tailored charcoal grey suit and a pressed white shirt, Isaiah looked like a retired judge or a tenured professor, someone who didn't speak much but whose words held weight when they did. His face was still, his eyes calm, but he hadn't stopped watching. From the moment Trinity had walked over to the table, from the second Veronica's voice rose above the others, Isaiah had watched, not with the curiosity of a gossip, but the intensity of someone taking mental notes. Veronica continued, lifting her wineglass with a theatrical flourish. "I mean, look at her. She's trembling like this is her first night on the floor. Maybe it is. Maybe they're so desperate they're just pulling kids in off the street now." Trinity didn't speak. Her cheeks were flushed, but her voice was steady. "I'll speak to the chef and ensure your meal is compensated," she said simply. "Oh, I'm sure you will," Veronica replied. "And maybe next time, try standing up straight. You represent this restaurant. You should look like you belong in it." The room wasn't entirely silent, but the tone had shifted. Diners who had previously been lost in conversation now shot glances toward the center table. A couple in the corner exchanged uneasy looks. A younger server across the room bit her lip, torn between stepping in and staying out of it. Trinity nodded once, politely, and stepped away. Isaiah Carter's eyes followed her until she disappeared through the swinging doors into the kitchen. Then, slowly, he picked up his linen napkin, dabbed the corner of his mouth, and leaned slightly forward in his booth. He didn't stand. Not yet. But he had seen enough. Back at the table, Veronica had returned to her stories, laughing about a yacht trip to the Bahamas where the staff didn't know how to properly serve caviar. Claudia and Denise laughed along, though now with a touch more caution. There was something uneasy in the air, a shift they couldn't quite name, but Veronica was oblivious, or maybe she didn't care. She waved her fork toward Trinity's empty spot and smirked. "Honestly, if I ran this place, I'd clean house, starting with little Miss Shaky Hands." She took a sip of wine and settled back in her chair, unaware that across the room, Isaiah Carter was finally rising to his feet. And what happened next? Well, the room would never forget it. Veronica Langston barely paused between her self-indulgent rants as she waved her fork dismissively, sending a flake of filet tumbling to the edge of her plate. "Honestly, if I ran this place, I'd clean house," she said with a snort, "starting with little Miss Shaky Hands." Claudia gave a thin smile and Denise chuckled nervously, but the energy at the table had shifted. Just slightly, the nearby patrons had grown noticeably quieter, some stealing glances toward the elegant woman in pearls who was still holding court, oblivious to the ripple her words were causing. The tension that had thickened in the air like southern humility hadn't gone unnoticed. At the far end of the restaurant, Isaiah Carter stood slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal grey suit. He moved with a calm, deliberate grace, like a man accustomed to being listened to the moment he spoke, though rarely needing to raise his voice to make a room fall silent. He made his way toward the bar, where the restaurant manager stood anxiously, already sensing the dissonance swelling under the dining room surface. Isaiah leaned in and spoke in a quiet tone, his words brief but clear. The manager's eyes widened slightly, and he gave a respectful nod before hurrying toward the back. Across the floor, Veronica continued sipping her wine, unaware that the spotlight she so often courted was now uncomfortably fixed on her. A few moments later, the manager returned to Veronica's table carrying a sleek silver tray. On it sat a chilled bottle of Dom Perignon and a crisp white envelope sealed with a deep burgundy wax stamp bearing the Harper's emblem. "Good evening, ladies," he began with practiced hospitality. "This is a special gesture from the owner of Harper's, who has taken notice of your evening with us tonight." Claudia let out a delighted gasp while Denise clapped her hands softly. "Oh, how lovely," she beamed. Veronica leaned back, thoroughly pleased with herself. "Well, it's about time someone noticed, Excellence," she said, her gaze flicking toward the kitchen doors, as if the champagne were an apology for the supposed incompetence she'd endured. But the manager didn't smile. Instead, He placed the envelope on the table in front of Veronica and stepped aside. And then, from behind him, Isaiah Carter stepped forward. The soft murmur of conversation in the dining room dissipated into a hush. The clink of a fork being set down was suddenly loud. All eyes turned to the tall, composed gentleman in the charcoal grey suit. Veronica blinked, her brow furrowing slightly, recognition flickering behind her eyes. Isaiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Good evening," he said, nodding slightly at the table. "My name is Isaiah Carter, and I'm the owner of this restaurant." Veronica's expression faltered, the smirk beginning to fade. "Oh, Mr. Carter," she said quickly, sitting up straighter. "What a surprise. I didn't realize you were here tonight." "I often prefer to observe from a distance," Isaiah replied smoothly. Then he turned slightly, extending a hand in the direction of the kitchen doors. "And tonight, I had the opportunity to observe something very important. My goddaughter, Trinity James, has been working under this roof with grace, humility, and strength. She is one of the most committed team members we have." The silence that followed was thick enough to slice with a steak knife. Veronica's friends looked everywhere but at Isaiah. Veronica's fingers twitched on her wine stem. She opened her mouth to speak, but Isaiah continued. "Miss Langston," he said evenly, "I listened as you mocked her. I listened as you called her names, criticized her professionalism, and implied she didn't belong here. I watched as you made sport out of demeaning a young woman who is, by every measure, an asset to this restaurant and to her community." A visible flush crept up Veronica's neck. Her voice was tight. I think you may have misunderstood." "I understood perfectly," Isaiah interrupted, his tone firm but never raised. "What I witnessed tonight is something I've seen too often in rooms like this. Power used to belittle, entitlement disguised as taste, disrespect wrapped in politeness and passed off as opinion." He paused and looked around the restaurant. Many guests were watching silently, nodding slightly, shifting in their seats. "Let me be clear," he said. "Money does not entitle anyone to mistreat those who serve them. Elegance is not in how expensive your wine is or how rare your steak is cooked. It's in how you treat people, especially those who show up every day doing honest work." He turned back to Veronica. "The champagne? That's no longer a gift. Nor is your meal tonight. Instead, the full value of your tab will be donated to a local scholarship fund. One that helps young women like Trinity pursue their dreams, despite financial obstacles and, frankly, attitudes like yours." The room held its breath. Veronica sat frozen, her eyes wide, her perfectly glossed lips parted but without words. Her carefully constructed confidence had fractured right there under the gaze of every eye in the room. Claudia looked down at her napkin. Denise quietly sipped from her nearly empty water glass. No one rushed to her defense. Isaiah placed a hand gently on the table. "Mrs. Langston, this is not punishment. It's perspective. You walked in tonight expecting to be the center of the room, and you still are, but not for the reasons you intended." And with that he stepped back. The restaurant remained silent for a beat before soft, earnest applause began to rise. Not loud, not performative, just real. Trinity, who had been standing behind the kitchen door unseen, felt her breath catch in her throat. She wasn't sure when she had started crying, but a tear traced the line of her cheek as she watched the man who had always told her to hold her head high do exactly what he had promised, have her back when it mattered most. Isaiah gave a respectful nod to the rest of the diners, then turned and made his way calmly back to his table, the quiet strength of his presence still lingering in the air. Veronica didn't move. She stared down at her plate, the once prized fillet now cold, untouched, and irrelevant. Her hands lay still in her lap, her fingers twitching, her silence louder than any retort. The envelope sat untouched on the table, its weight a reminder of a lesson she never expected to be taught in public. And as the room slowly returned to motion, servers moving with new energy, conversations restarting with new softness, one thing was clear. A line had been drawn, A message had been delivered, and for the first time in a long time, Veronica Langston had nothing left to say. Veronica Langston didn't touch her food again. The once sizzling fillet lay abandoned, now as cold as the silence around her. Her fingers remained clasped in her lap, the weight of Isaiah Carter's words pressing on her chest like a stone. Her friends had fallen uncharacteristically quiet, casting nervous side glances but offering no defense, no clever recovery to save face. There was nothing to say, not after the applause. Not after the owner of the very restaurant she sought to impress made it clear her behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. She looked up once, cautiously, and met the eyes of a nearby couple who had been listening the entire time. They didn't offer her sympathy, just a quiet nod of approval, directed toward the kitchen, where Trinity had disappeared. Outside the restaurant's tall windows, the Charleston evening had slipped into twilight, the lamplight from the street casting soft halos across the sidewalk. Inside, the mood at Harper's had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Where moments earlier there had been tension, now there was reflection. Conversations picked up again, but they were more subdued. Guests exchanged knowing glances and small comments about what they'd witnessed. How respect had been reclaimed, without a raised voice or a public shaming, only truth spoken plainly and with grace. Trinity stood just beyond the kitchen doors, one hand braced against the wall, her breath catching in her chest. Her manager, a tall woman named Elise with kind eyes and steady hands, approached her slowly. "Take a break," she said gently, placing a hand on Trinity's shoulder. "You've earned it." Trinity hesitated. "I'm okay," she murmured, her voice quiet but sure. "No," Elise replied with a warm smile. "You're more than okay. I've never seen anything like that. And you, Trinity, you handled it better than most grown professionals ever could." Trinity's throat tightened again, but she gave a small nod, her voice momentarily lost. She stepped outside through the side door that led to a quiet alley framed with ivy-covered brick. The cool air was a balm to her flushed skin. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, letting the moment settle. Her chest still carried the weight of Veronica's cruel words, but now there was something else, something stronger, layered over it. The sound of applause, the look in Isaiah's eyes, the affirmation that she mattered, not just as an employee, but as a human being. After a few deep breaths, she re-entered the restaurant through the staff door. Elise caught her eye immediately and handed her a tall glass of water. "You've got people asking for you," she said with a smile. "Not complaints, just customers who want to say thank you, and tips." Trinity blinked. "Tips?" Elise nodded toward the bar. "One gentleman left a $100 bill and said it was for your courage. Another woman said she wanted to shake your hand before she left. You've become something of a quiet legend in here tonight." Trinity smiled softly, still uncertain what to do with the attention. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "I just did my job." "You did more than that," Elise replied. "You kept your dignity when most would have snapped, and you reminded all of us what strength looks like." Trinity tucked a curl behind her ear, steadied herself, and stepped back onto the floor. This time, as she walked through the dining room, something was different. Guests she'd served earlier now looked at her with respect. Not the polite kind reserved for service workers, but genuine regard. A woman in her 60s reached out gently as Trinity passed by and said, "You were grace tonight. Absolute grace." At another table, a man in a blazer offered a slow nod and a quiet, "Thank you for how you carried yourself." Trinity thanked them each with humility, her posture just a little taller than before. Veronica, meanwhile, remained seated, her world noticeably smaller. She no longer laughed. Her shoulders had rounded inward, and her gaze stayed low, flicking up only when the occasional whisper reached her ears. Claudia and Denise exchanged looks, uncertain whether to stay or go, their once easy camaraderie now weighed down by silence. At last Veronica stood. Her chair scraped softly against the floor, though to her it sounded like thunder. She left the envelope untouched on the table, unable to look at the staff, the diners, or even herself in the reflective glass of the windows as she passed. Outside, she paused at the door. Claudia murmured something that sounded like, "Let's just go," but Veronica raised one hand, signaling she needed a minute. Her friends stepped aside, and for the first time in what felt like years, Veronica Langston looked small. Not in stature, but in presence. She didn't cry. She didn't lash out. She simply stood there, quiet, alone, with the echo of a night that had not gone the way she expected. Inside, Trinity continued her work, but now it felt different. She moved with purpose, not just professionalism. She took orders, poured wine, reset tables, and she smiled, not because she had to, but because something inside her had been restored. Across the room, Isaiah Carter sat back in his chair, watching her with quiet pride. He wasn't one for public declarations, and he didn't enjoy scenes. But tonight he'd made one for the right reason, not for revenge, not to embarrass, but to remind people that power used kindly is still power. Elise approached his table. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "that was remarkable, thank you." He waved her off gently. "Trinity did the hard part. I just did what needed to be done." Elise nodded. "Still, we needed to see it." As the night wound down, guests filtered out one by one. Several paused at Trinity's station to offer final words of encouragement or admiration. Others simply nodded as they passed her, their quiet acknowledgement more meaningful than applause. Tips were higher than usual. Smiles were warmer, and in that simple restaurant, something fundamental had changed. Not just for Trinity, but for everyone who had been present. Veronica and her friends walked slowly down the cobblestone sidewalk, their voices hushed. No one spoke of dinner. No one mentioned the steak. Whatever they had come for that night had been eclipsed by what they received. A mirror held up to the version of themselves they rarely confronted. Trinity finished her shift just before midnight. As she gathered her things in the back, she noticed a small envelope on the employee message board with her name on it. Inside was a handwritten note from Isaiah. "Tonight, you reminded everyone what dignity looks like. Don't ever let anyone make you question your worth again. Proud doesn't begin to cover it." She folded the note gently, holding it to her chest for a moment before slipping it into her bag. Outside, the Charleston air was crisp. The city lights shimmered on the water, and the sound of jazz spilled faintly from a bar down the street. Trinity walked to her bus stop, her stride steady, her heart light. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy, but tonight she had been seen, heard, and valued. And that kind of recognition didn't fade. It planted something deeper. Inside the restaurant, Isaiah remained for a few minutes longer, watching the staff as they moved through the final cleanup, their movements a little more intentional than usual. He didn't need to say anything else. The lesson had already been written, in silence, in applause, in the way eyes met across tables with understanding. Harper's would continue serving fine food under sparkling chandeliers, but from this night forward, it would also carry a quiet legacy, a reminder etched into its walls and whispered between its patrons. Respect is never out of season, and true class is measured not by money, but by how we treat one another when no one's watching. Or when everyone is. What happened at Harper's that night wasn't just about a steak cooked the wrong way, or a customer being a little too demanding. It was about something deeper, something far more common than we like to admit. In a world that often confuses status with superiority and money with merit, we are reminded that the true measure of a person is how they treat others, especially those who serve them. Veronica Langston walked into that restaurant believing she was above reproach. Her wealth, her social standing, her self-importance, all of it had shielded her from accountability for a long time. But when she chose to use her influence to belittle a young woman doing honest work, she exposed not Trinity's supposed shortcomings, but her own lack of character. What she didn't expect, what people like her rarely expect, is that someone would stand up not with volume or anger, but with dignity and truth. Isaiah Carter didn't just defend Trinity. He reminded all of us that silence in the face of cruelty is its own form of complicity, and Trinity, though shaken, showed us what strength looks like when wrapped in humility. She didn't lash out. She didn't retaliate. She stood tall, took the high road, and let her integrity speak for her. In doing so, she earned not just the respect of a restaurant full of strangers, but something more enduring, self-respect and a legacy of grace. So what's the lesson for us? It's simple. Be kind. Not because someone is watching, not because you're afraid of consequences, but because every person you meet, every server, cashier, janitor, delivery driver, is fighting a battle you may never see. And your words, your tone, your choices, they all matter. The world doesn't need more critics, it needs more compassion. True class isn't about what's around your neck or in your bank account, it's about how you carry yourself when someone else has no power over you. If you take one thing away from this story, let it be this. You don't have to be wealthy to have influence. You just need the courage to do the right thing when it counts. To every listener who's joined us today, thank you. Your time is valuable, and the fact that you chose to spend part of it here means the world. At US Justice Story, we're not just telling stories. We're starting conversations. Conversations about respect, dignity, and the quiet power of doing the right thing. If this story touched you, made you think, or reminded you of something important, please share it with someone else. Let's keep the message moving. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories that uplift, challenge, and inspire. Until next time, remember, kindness costs nothing, but its impact can last a lifetime.